Kane aimed his gun directly at William. Eleanor didn't think. She ran. "No!" she screamed, throwing herself in front of him. The gunshot cracked like thunder. Eleanor felt the burning impact along her ribs. The world tilted. William caught her before she hit the ground. Ellie. But how did a Boston school teacher and her elderly mother end up in a gunfight in the New Mexico desert? It all started 2 weeks earlier, when Eleanor Carter stepped off a stagecoach with a dying mother and a terrible secret. The dust hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Eleanor Carter stood before the bank building of Fort Stanton, New Mexico, her fingers trembling as they gripped the worn envelope. The letter inside had been read so many times the creases threatened to tear through the paper entirely. Beside her, perched atop their meager collection of luggage, her mother Margaret struggled to catch her breath in the thin September heat. The year was 1878. The Civil War had ended more than a decade ago, but its ghost still wandered the American West, lingering in the eyes of men who had seen too much, and in the desperate hearts of women trying to survive in a world that offered them few mercies. Eleanor's traveling dress, once a respectable shade of deep blue, now bore the stains of 2 weeks on dusty trains and bumpy stagecoaches. Her mother's condition had worsened with each mile westward. The cough that had seemed merely persistent in Boston now rattled in Margaret's chest like stones in a tin can. A woman passed on the wooden boardwalk. She glanced at Eleanor and Margaret, her eyes narrowing with the particular cruelty that respectable people reserve for those they deem beneath them. Eleanor lifted her chin. She had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes the only possession that could not be taken by force. The memory crashed over her without warning. 2 weeks earlier, Boston, the boarding house on Tremont Street, where they had lived for the past 6 months. The knock on the door had come at dawn. Eleanor had known immediately that something was wrong. Good news never arrived before sunrise. The detective had been tall, wearing a brown suit that hung oddly on his frame. Behind him, 2 police officers waited with expressions carved from stone. "Margaret Carter," the detective had said, his voice flat and official. "You are wanted for questioning in the murder of Thomas Whitmore." Eleanor remembered how her mother had gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles going white. How the room had seemed to tilt and spin, how the word murder had hung in the air like smoke. They had run. God help them, they had run. Eleanor blinked, forcing herself back to the present. The New Mexico sun beat down mercilessly. Around her, Fort Stanton carried on with its daily business. Cowboys walked past, their spurs jingling. Somewhere, a blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil. A dog barked in the distance. She looked down at the letter in her hand one more time. "Dear Miss Carter," it began, "your correspondence has been a bright spot in what has been a solitary existence. If you are willing to make the journey, I would be honored to meet you in person and discuss the possibility of a future together. Respectfully yours, William Thornton." Eleanor had written to him 3 times. He had responded to each letter with words that seemed honest, thoughtful, and kind. She had told him about herself, about her teaching experience, about her desire for a new life. She had not told him about her mother. She had not told him about the accusation. She had not told him that they were running from a crime Margaret swore she did not commit. And now they were here, at the edge of the world, with nowhere left to run. "Ellie," her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe we should go back. Find somewhere to hide. You don't have to do this." Eleanor turned to look at the woman who had raised her alone after her father died. Margaret Carter had once been beautiful. She was still beautiful, Eleanor thought, but now it was the beauty of something that had endured too much and refused to break. Silver hair pulled back in a bun, eyes that had seen hardship and chosen kindness anyway. Hands that had sewn 1,000 garments and wiped away 1,000 tears. "There's nowhere else, Mama," Eleanor said quietly. "You know that." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. They both knew the truth. Boston was closed to them. The detective had made that clear. And if William Thornton rejected them, if he turned them away when he saw that Eleanor had brought her elderly, supposedly dying mother along, then they would have nothing. No money, no prospects, no future. Eleanor looked up at the bank building again. Somewhere in this town, William Thornton was going about his day, unaware that his mail-order bride had arrived, unaware that she had brought complications he had not bargained for, unaware that his life was about to become infinitely more complex. A stagecoach rattled down the main street, its wheels kicking up more dust. Eleanor watched it approach, and for a moment she wondered if she should simply climb aboard and disappear into the vast American landscape. But where would they go? And how long could they run before Margaret's health gave out entirely? Oh, this was their last chance. Their only chance. Leonor tucked the letter back into her bag and straightened her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her head held high. She had learned that much from her father, the scholar who had died poor but proud, believing that dignity mattered more than comfort. "Come on, Mama," she said, reaching down to help Margaret to her feet. "Let's find out what kind of man answers an advertisement for a wife." Across the street near the general store, a man stood watching the scene unfold. William Thornton had been in town since mid-morning, conducting the weekly errands that kept a ranch running. Flour, salt, ammunition, a new bridle for his best gelding. The tasks were routine, almost meditative in their familiarity. They gave structure to days that might otherwise blur into an endless repetition of work and solitude. He had not been thinking about Eleanor Carter. Or rather, he had been trying not to think about her. 6 weeks since he had sent that last letter. 6 weeks of wondering if she would actually come, or if she would read his words and decide that a ranch in New Mexico was too far, too remote, too uncertain. 6 weeks of telling himself it did not matter either way. But it did matter. William knew himself well enough to admit that much. The letters had stirred something in him that he thought had died 3 years ago when he buried his wife. Margaret. His Margaret. The irony of the name was not lost on him. The universe had a cruel sense of humor, sometimes. He shifted the sack of flour on his shoulder and turned toward his wagon. That was when he saw the stagecoach approaching. It was the regular afternoon run from Santa Fe. Nothing unusual about it. William had no reason to pay it any particular attention. But something made him pause. Some instinct. Some whisper of fate. The coach pulled to a stop in front of the modest hotel that served as Fort Stanton's main gathering place for travelers. The driver, a man named Pete, who William knew, slightly climbed down and opened the door. William watched. A gloved hand appeared first, reaching for Pete's assistance. Then a woman stepped down, and William felt his breath catch despite himself. She was not what he had expected. Though truthfully, William was not sure what he had expected. The letters had conveyed intelligence and warmth, but words on paper could not capture the reality of a person, could not show the way she moved with careful precision as if conserving energy, could not reveal the proud set of her shoulders despite obvious exhaustion, could not demonstrate the fierce intelligence in eyes that swept across the unfamiliar town with both hope and wariness. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. Her face held an intelligence that made William think of his mother, who had been the smartest person he had ever known and had died far too young. This had to be Eleanor Carter. Everything in William's gut told him so, and then the second figure emerged from the coach. An elderly woman, thin and frail, with silver hair and a face mapped with wrinkles. She took Eleanor's offered hand, carefully moving as if each step caused pain. When she turned slightly, William saw the bluish tint to her lips that spoke of heart trouble or lung disease or both. The older woman coughed, a deep, rattling sound that carried across the street. Eleanor immediately produced a handkerchief, helping her mother press it to her mouth. When the coughing subsided, Eleanor carefully tucked the cloth away, but not before William caught a glimpse of red. Blood. The letters had never mentioned a mother. William stood very still, his mind working through implications. Eleanor Carter had come to New Mexico to marry a stranger, and she had brought her dying mother with her. The deception should have angered him, would have angered many men. But William found himself thinking instead about what kind of desperation drove such a choice. What kind of love made a woman drag her sick mother across half a continent on the slim hope that a man she had never met might show mercy? A sleek black carriage pulled up beside William's wagon. The door opened and Silas Blackwood stepped out, immaculate as always, in a suit that cost more than most men in Fort Stanton earned in 6 months. He was 45 years old, handsome in a cold way, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. "Waiting for someone, Thornton, Silas asked, his voice smooth as oil and twice as slick. William did not look at him. "Minding my business." "Heard you sent for a mail order, bride." Silas moved to stand beside William, following his gaze toward the stagecoach. "That Herb..." William said nothing. Silas smiled. It was the smile of a cat watching a mouse. "2 of them, looks like. You only paid for one, though. Must be confusing." "Not your concern." Oh, but it is my concern, Thornton. Everything in this town is my concern. Silas stepped closer, lowering his voice so only William could hear. Speaking of which, we need to discuss your loan. $800 due by Christmas. That's less than 3 months away. William's jaw tightened. I'm aware. Just want to make sure we understand each other. Silas brushed an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. I'd hate for there to be any confusion when the payment comes due. Thornton Ranch is prime land. Hate to see it go to auction. Won't come to that? For your sake, I hope not. Silas glanced toward Eleanor and Margaret again. Especially now that you've got extra mouths to feed. Makes a man wonder about your priorities. William turned to face him fully. We done here. Silas held his gaze for a long moment, then stepped back with that same cold smile. For now, but Thornton I'll be watching. Very closely. He climbed back into his carriage and departed, leaving William standing alone with a sack of flour and a decision to make. Across the street, Eleanor was clearly in some kind of difficulty. The station manager, Clyde, had approached her. William could not hear the conversation, but he could read body language well enough. Clyde was shaking his head. Eleanor's spine was stiffening. Margaret looked close to collapse. William saw Eleanor reach into her bag and pull out a small leather purse. She opened it and extracted what looked like a few crumpled bills. Everything they had left in the world, probably. Clyde shook his head again more firmly this time. A small crowd had begun to gather. Fort Stanton was small enough that any unusual occurrence drew attention, and the arrival of 2 Eastern women was definitely unusual. William recognized several faces. Ruth Davies, who ran the cafe, Dr. Chen, the Chinese physician, who had settled here 5 years ago and quietly earned the respect of the community. Jacob Reeves, the aging sheriff, who had been keeping the peace since before the war. And Victoria Blackwood, Silas's wife, emerging from the general store with 2 women from her church group in tow. Victoria was 35, beautiful in a brittle way, impeccably dressed even in the frontier heat. She had come from Philadelphia society and never let anyone forget it. She ran the Ladies' Auxiliary at the church-organized charity drives for the poor and ruled Fort Stanton's social hierarchy with an iron fist wrapped in lace gloves. She looked at Eleanor and Margaret, and William saw her eyes narrow. This was going to get ugly. Victoria glided across the street with her companions following like ducklings. She stopped a few feet from Eleanor, close enough to be heard but far enough to maintain social distance. My word, Victoria said, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that was really just cruelty with better manners. Are you lost, dear? This must be very confusing for you. Eleanor turned to face her. Not lost, ma'am, just arrived. Oh, Victoria's eyebrows rose with practiced surprise. And who might you be? Eleanor Carter, from Boston. Understanding dawned on Victoria's face, followed by something that looked like glee. The mail-order bride, how quaint, and you brought your mother. Her gaze moved to Margaret, taking in every detail of the older woman's obvious illness. How thoughtful. The words dripped with venom, disguised as sweetness. Eleanor's face flushed, but she did not look away. My mother is traveling with me, yes. I see. Victoria glanced at her companions, who tittered on cue. Well, I suppose Mr. Thornton will have quite the surprise waiting for him. If he still wants anything to do with you, of course. Men can be so particular about complications. Margaret swayed slightly. Eleanor immediately moved to support her one arm around her mother's thin shoulders. Mama, careful, Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying across the street despite its gentle tone. We're here. We made it. Victoria watched this display with an expression that might have been mistaken for sympathy if not for the coldness in her eyes. Perhaps you should return to Boston, dear. This life is hard enough without. She gestured vaguely at Margaret. Additional burdens. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting Victoria's gaze directly. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Blackwood. Victoria Blackwood. Mrs. Blackwood, but we'll manage. Will you? Victoria's smile sharpened. I do hope so, for everyone's sake. She turned and swept away, her companions following. But the damage was done. The crowd that had gathered was now openly staring, whispering behind hands. Eleanor stood frozen, one arm still supporting her mother, the other clutching their bags. William saw the moment she understood how precarious her situation truly was. Saw her shoulders straighten even further. Saw her jaw set with determination. saw her refuse to show fear or shame even as the town judged her. Clyde cleared his throat uncomfortably. Look, miss, I'm sorry, but the hotel's full up. Nothing I can do. I have money, Eleanor said, still full. Then perhaps another boarding house? Ain't really got one that takes. Clyde trailed off, glancing at Margaret. That is, most places don't want someone who's sickly, could be catching you, understand. William saw Eleanor's face go pale, saw her mother close her eyes as if in pain that had nothing to do with her lungs, saw the two of them standing there in the New Mexico dust with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Silas Blackwood's words echoed in his mind. Extra mouths to feed, $800 due, 3 months to pay. This was the sensible moment to walk away, to let Eleanor Carter find her own solution. She had deceived him after all by not mentioning her mother in the letters. She had complications written all over her. Getting involved would be foolish. William set down the sack of flour. He crossed the street with long, deliberate strides, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. The crowd parted for him automatically. People in Fort Stanton knew William Thornton, knew he was fair but not soft, knew he kept his word and expected others to do the same, knew he was not a man to cross without good reason. He stopped a few feet from Eleanor and removed his hat. His mother had drilled that particular courtesy into him before she passed, and some habits ran too deep to break. Excuse me, he said. Eleanor turned. Up close, he could see that her eyes were a striking hazel green and gold, mixed together in a way that reminded him of the cottonwood trees along the creek in autumn. She studied him with a gaze that held both hope and wariness, intelligence and exhaustion. Miss Sullivan, he asked, using the name she had signed in her letters. Her eyes widened slightly. Carter. Eleanor Carter. In the letters I used. She trailed off, then seemed to gather herself. Are you Mr. Thornton? William Thornton. Yes, ma'am. He nodded, then turned his attention to the elderly woman leaning heavily on her daughter's arm. And you must be Mrs. Carter. Margaret's eyes faded blue but still sharp, fixed on him with an intensity that felt like being measured and weighed. I am Margaret Carter. I apologize for the surprise, Mr. Thornton. My daughter wrote to tell you, but I suppose the letter did not arrive before we had to leave Boston. William processed this carefully. They had fled Boston in such haste that they could not wait for his response. That spoke of urgency, desperation, perhaps even danger. No letter arrived, he confirmed, keeping his voice neutral and kind. But that doesn't change anything important. Eleanor's breath caught audibly. Mr. Thornton, I can explain. William held up a hand gently. My home has room for both of you, if you're still willing to consider the arrangement we discussed. The relief that flooded Eleanor's face was so profound that William felt something in his chest constrict. She had been braced for rejection, had probably rehearsed a dozen different speeches defending her choice to bring her mother. The fact that he had not immediately turned away seemed to have caught her completely off guard. You mean that? Eleanor asked, and there was a tremor in her voice she could not quite hide. We wouldn't be an imposition. I can work, Mr. Thornton. I can cook and clean and help with whatever needs doing. Mama can mend, even if her hands aren't as steady as they once were. We'll earn our keep. I'm sure you will both be valuable additions to the household, William said, and he meant it. But first, let's get you settled and fed. You must be exhausted from the journey. Clyde, who had been watching this exchange with undisguised interest, cleared his throat. You planning to marry right away, then? William Reverend Morris is out visiting the Henderson Ranch, but he'll be back tomorrow. William saw Eleanor's cheeks flush, saw Margaret's eyes narrow slightly at the station manager's presumptuousness. That's a discussion for later, William said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. Right now, these ladies need rest and a proper meal. I'll take them out to the ranch. He collected their bags before either woman could protest. The trunk was surprisingly light. Everything they owned in the world, William realized, fit in these few pieces of luggage. The weight of their trust in him, a stranger, settled over his shoulders with far more heft than any physical burden. My wagon's hitched outside the saloon, he said. It's not far. They walked a short distance, and William found himself acutely aware of the picture they must make. Him with his worn work clothes and sun-weathered face leading two Boston women through the dusty streets of a frontier town that probably seemed primitive beyond belief to them. But neither woman complained. Neither made disparaging comments about the rough conditions or the curious stares that followed them. Eleanor simply held her mother's arm, matching her pace to Margaret's slower steps, murmuring quiet encouragement. William's wagon was exactly where he had left it, his two horses standing patiently in the shade. He helped Margaret up first, noting how she struggled to lift her legs high enough to manage the step. She was sicker than she was letting on, he suspected. Much sicker. Eleanor climbed up with more ease, settling beside her mother and immediately arranging their skirts to protect against the dust. William took his seat and picked up the reins. It's about 5 miles to the ranch. The road's rough in places, but I'll do my best to avoid the worst of it. There's water in the canteen under the seat if you need it. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly. You're very kind, Mr. Thornton. More than we had any right to expect. William guided the horses out of town, following the familiar road that led south toward his land. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. I put an advertisement in that newspaper looking for a partner, William said after a few moments of silence. Someone to build a life with. The circumstances aren't exactly what either of us anticipated, but the fundamental truth remains the same. I need someone and you need somewhere to be. Seems to me we can help each other. Margaret made a small sound that might have been approval. Eleanor's hand found her mother's and squeezed. William kept his eyes on the road, giving them a moment of privacy despite the close quarters. The landscape around Fort Stanton was harsh and beautiful in equal measure. The Capitan Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks touched with the first hints of autumn snow, while the valleys were painted in shades of brown and gold. Pinon and juniper trees dotted the arid soil, somehow thriving where other plants would wither. William loved this land with a fierceness that sometimes surprised him, loved its honesty and its challenges. It demanded everything from those who tried to make a life here, but it gave back in ways that were harder to quantify. Freedom, space, the chance to be who you truly were without the weight of society's expectations. It's very different from Boston, Eleanor observed, and William could not tell if that was a complaint or simply a statement of fact. It is, he agreed. Takes some getting used to. But there's beauty here if you look for it. The sunsets are like nothing you've ever seen. And in spring, when the wildflowers bloom, the whole valley turns colors that don't seem real. I like it, Margaret said, unexpectedly, her thin voice carrying conviction. It feels like a place where a person could start over, where the past doesn't matter as much as what you do today. William glanced at her, caught by the wistfulness in her tone. There was a story there, he sensed, layers of history that had brought these two women to his doorstep. But stories could wait. Right now, what mattered was getting them home and making them feel safe. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise. William tried to see it through their eyes. It was not much. Just a simple structure of adobe and wood with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. He had built it himself 7 years ago, when he first claimed this land, adding to it gradually as his herd grew and his resources allowed. William helped both women down from the wagon. As they approached the house, a small figure burst through the door. "Papa, you're back." A boy of about 8 years old ran toward them all. Energy and excitement. William caught him easily, steadying the child. "Samuel, where are your manners? We have guests." The boy looked at Eleanor and Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "Who are they?" "This is Miss Eleanor and Mrs. Margaret. They'll be staying with us." William's hand rested on the boy's shoulder. "Samuel's been with me for 2 years now. His father was a ranch hand who died in an accident. Seemed right to keep him on." Samuel studied the newcomers seriously, then offered his hand to Eleanor with surprising formality. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." Eleanor shook his hand, charmed despite herself. "The pleasure is mine, Samuel." The barn stood 50 yards to the east, solid and practical. The chicken coop beside it, a small bunkhouse for the ranch hands he employed during busy seasons. The corral where several horses stood dozing in the late afternoon heat. "Home," William said, simply pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. He helped both women down again, noting how unsteady Margaret was on her feet. Inside the house was clean but Spartan, furnished with pieces William had made himself or acquired through trades in town. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace that would be essential when winter came. 2 bedrooms opened off the main space. William had already decided he would give up his own room for the women and sleep in the bunkhouse until other arrangements could be made. I know it's not fancy, William said, setting their bags down by the door. But it's solid and warm and dry. You'll have the bedroom on the right. I'll move my things out to the bunkhouse tonight. Absolutely not, Eleanor said firmly, the first spark of fire showing in her demeanor. We cannot displace you from your own room, Mr. Thornton. Mama and I will be perfectly comfortable in the smaller room. We've shared quarters before. William started to argue, then saw the set of her jaw and recognized that this was important to her. Pride, he understood, was sometimes all a person had left. The smaller room then, he conceded, but if you change your minds, the offer stands. Now let me get a fire started and put some coffee on. I have stew from yesterday that I can heat up and bread that's only a day old. He busied himself with these tasks, aware that both women were taking in their surroundings with careful attention. The house reflected his bachelor existence in ways that were probably obvious to anyone with experience running a household. Everything was functional but minimal. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no decorations or softness anywhere. Eleanor seemed to come to some internal decision. She removed her traveling jacket and hung it on one of the pegs by the door, then rolled up her sleeves in a businesslike manner. "Let me help," she said. "Where do you keep your plates and utensils?" "You don't need to do that. You just arrived. You should rest." "I've been sitting for days," Eleanor countered. "I'd rather be useful. Please, Mr. Thornton, let me help." They worked together in the kitchen area, and William found himself hyper-aware of her presence in his space. She moved with efficiency, asking questions about where things were stored and nodding when he explained his rudimentary system of organization. Within 30 minutes, the small table was set and the stew was warming over the fire, filling the house with savory aromas that made William realize how hungry he was. Margaret had settled into the chair closest to the fireplace. William noticed she was shivering slightly, despite the warmth of the day. He grabbed a blanket from his room and draped it over her shoulders without comment, earning a grateful smile from Eleanor. They ate together as the sun set outside, painting the sky in those brilliant shades William had promised. The conversation was stilted, at first all of them aware that they were essentially strangers thrust into an intimate situation. But gradually, as hunger was satisfied and the warmth of the fire and food worked their magic, the tension began to ease. William learned that Margaret had been a seamstress in Boston, that her husband had died 15 years earlier in an accident at the docks, that she had raised Eleanor alone, working long hours to ensure her daughter received an education. Eleanor had been teaching at a small school for girls from poor families, a charity institution that relied on donations to operate. When their primary benefactor died and his heirs chose not to continue his philanthropy, the school had closed with only a week's notice. "I was living in a boarding house," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes on her plate, "saving every penny in hopes of eventually having enough to open my own school. But the loss of my income made that impossible. And then Mama became ill." She paused, her hand reaching across the table to grasp Margaret's. "The doctor said she needed rest and fresh air. Things that are impossible to find in the city when you have no money. I saw your cousin's advertisement in a newspaper someone had left at the boarding house. It seemed like Providence, a chance for both of us to start over." "So you wrote to me," William said, understanding now the desperation that had driven her. "I wrote to you." "Oh," Eleanor confirmed. "And you wrote back. Your letters were kind, Mr. Thornton. You seemed like a good man, someone who understood what it meant to work hard and to value honesty." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I know this isn't what you signed on for. Bringing both of us. If you want us to leave, if this is too much, I will understand. We can go back to town and I'll find some kind of work there." William set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Miss Carter, I meant what I said earlier. My home has room for both of you. I'm not going to turn you away because circumstances are more complicated than I expected. Life is always more complicated than we expect. What matters is how we handle it." Margaret spoke up, then her voice stronger than it had been all evening. "You are a good man, Mr. Thornton. I can see why my daughter chose you. But I want you to know that I don't intend to be a burden. I can still be useful even if my body doesn't cooperate the way it used to. And I won't stand in the way of whatever arrangement you and Eleanor come to." "Mama," Eleanor said, mortified. But William held up a hand gently. "Mrs. Carter, you're not a burden. You are welcome here in whatever way makes sense for all of us." He looked at Eleanor, saw the uncertainty and hope warring in her expression. As for marriage, that's something Miss Carter and I need to discuss when we've both had time to think. There's no rush. We'll figure out what works. Later, after the women had retired to their room and William had moved his essential belongings to the bunkhouse, he stood on the porch and looked up at the stars. The night was clear and cool. He could hear the cattle lowing in the distance and the yip of coyotes on the far ridge. This was his life, the one he had built through years of hard work and determination. And now, in the span of a few hours, it had been turned upside down by the arrival of two women who brought with them complications and responsibilities he had not fully anticipated. But as he stood there in the darkness, William did not feel regret. Instead, he felt something that might have been hope. The house had felt less empty tonight, warmed by more than just the fire in the hearth. There had been conversation and connection, the kind of human contact he had been missing without fully realizing it. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be practical matters to sort out, decisions to make about sleeping arrangements and work divisions, and the question of marriage that hung between him and Eleanor like morning mist. But tonight, William allowed himself to simply feel grateful that they had come, that they had trusted him enough to make this journey. Inside the house, Eleanor helped her mother change into a nightgown and get settled into the narrow bed that took up most of the smaller room. There was barely space for a second person to sleep on the floor, but Eleanor had spread blankets there and made herself as comfortable as possible. It was no worse than some of the accommodations they had endured on the journey west and far better than the alternatives they had faced in Boston. "He's not what I expected," Margaret said softly in the darkness. "What did you expect?" Eleanor asked, though she knew what her mother meant. William was not the grizzled, rough character she had feared might answer a mail-order bride advertisement. He was weathered by sun and work, yes, but there was kindness in his eyes and a gentleness in the way he moved that spoke of a man who was deliberate in his actions. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Someone harder, perhaps, more desperate. But Mr. Thornton seems like a man who chose to seek a wife, not someone who had no other options. That speaks well of him." Eleanor thought about this as she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Her mother was right. William could have reacted with anger or resentment when he realized she had brought an additional person into their arrangement. Many men would have. But instead, he had responded with grace and acceptance, had made room in his home and his life without hesitation. She found herself remembering the way his hands had looked as he helped her mother from the wagon. Strong and capable, but infinitely careful. The way he had draped the blanket over Margaret's shoulders without making a fuss about it, as if caring for others was simply what one did. In Boston, Eleanor had known men who performed charity like it was a performance, who wanted recognition for every small kindness. William's generosity seemed to come from a different place entirely, something fundamental to his character rather than something he did for show. "Do you think you could love him?" Margaret asked, and Eleanor was glad for the darkness that hid her blush. "I don't know him well enough to answer that," Eleanor said honestly, "but I think I could respect him, and perhaps that's a better foundation for a marriage than romantic notions." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed, though she sounded doubtful. "But you deserve romance too, my dear. You deserve to be loved, not just respected." Eleanor did not answer, but she found herself hoping that her mother was right, that maybe in this harsh and beautiful land she might find both respect and love, that the arrangement that had begun as a practical solution to desperate circumstances might become something more. The next morning arrived with the kind of brightness that only exists in high desert country. William rose before dawn, as was his habit, and headed out to tend to the cattle and horses. When he returned an hour later, he found Eleanor already awake and moving quietly around the kitchen. She had somehow managed to locate his supplies and was preparing breakfast. Eggs from the chickens, bacon from the smokehouse, fresh biscuits rising in the Dutch oven by the fire. "You didn't have to do all this," William said, hanging his hat on the peg. "I wanted to," Eleanor replied. "Besides, I need to learn where everything is. Might as well start now." They ate together, the conversation gradually becoming less stilted as they learned each other's patterns and preferences. Margaret joined them, looking better after a full night's rest. The color had returned to her cheeks, though the cough still rattled occasionally. After breakfast, William excused himself to continue his morning chores. Eleanor insisted on washing the dishes, and when she finished, she found him in the barn. "Mr. Thornton, I wonder if we might talk," she said. William set down the curry comb he had been using on one of the horses. "Of course." They walked out to the porch where the morning sun was just beginning to warm the boards beneath their feet. Eleanor seemed to be gathering her thoughts, choosing her words carefully. I need to be honest with you about something, about our situation. All right. When I wrote to you, I wasn't entirely truthful. She took a breath. I did mention my mother in one letter, but I sent it so late that I knew you wouldn't receive it before we had to leave. I I wasn't sure you would still want me to come if you knew. William considered this. Why did you have to leave Boston so quickly? Eleanor's hands twisted together. My mother's health, it was getting worse and I was afraid. She trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. Mr. Thornton, we had nowhere else to go. The boarding house wanted us out. The doctor bills were mounting. I saw your advertisement, and it felt like the only door that hadn't already slammed in our faces. It was not the whole truth. William could sense that. There were pieces missing from the story, but he also understood that trust took time, and Eleanor had no reason yet to trust him completely. I appreciate your honesty, he said, and I want to be honest with you too. Eleanor looked up, her hazel eyes searching his face. I need to tell you something, William continued. Something about my financial situation that might affect your decision to stay. He explained about the loan, the $800 he owed to Silas Blackwood. The deadline of Christmas, less than 3 months away, the very real possibility that he might lose part of his land if he could not make the payment. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each word. I won't bring you into a sinking ship without you knowing the truth, William finished. If you want to go back to town, find some other situation I'll understand. I'll even help you, give you money for a room until you can get settled. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I can teach. Mama can sew. We'll help. I can't ask that of you. You're not asking. I'm offering. She met his gaze directly. Mr. Thornton, you took us in when you had every reason to turn us away. You've been nothing but kind since we arrived. If we can help, we will. William, he said quietly. Call me William. William. She tested the name and he liked the way it sounded in her voice. And you should call me Eleanor, or Ellie. My father used to call me Ellie. Ellie, William repeated. They stood there on the porch, the morning sun warming them, and something shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. They were no longer strangers bound by an advertisement and desperation. They were two people beginning to know each other, beginning to build something that might, with time and care, become something real. But even as that fragile hope took root, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above the ranch. A man on horseback, too far away to be identified, but close enough to see everything that happened below. After a few minutes, the watcher turned his horse and rode back toward Fort Stanton, carrying information that would soon reach interested ears. The game, though neither William nor Eleanor knew it yet, had already begun. The days at Thornton Ranch soon settled into a rhythm that surprised all three of them. William rose before dawn, as always heading out to tend the cattle and horses that were his livelihood. Eleanor woke shortly after stoking the fire and preparing breakfast with the supplies William kept in his modest larder. When he returned, they ate together, the conversation gradually becoming less stilted as they learned each other's patterns and preferences. Margaret stayed inside for the most part, her strength not equal to the demands of ranch life. But she kept herself occupied with mending and sewing, her trained seamstress's eye noting immediately that William's clothes bore testament to years of bachelor repairs. She took obvious pleasure in fixing seams and replacing buttons with the skill of someone who had once made their living with needle and thread. Samuel proved to be a curious, energetic presence around the ranch. He followed William everywhere during the day, learning the work of cattle and horses. But in the evenings, he was drawn to Eleanor's teaching supplies, watching with wide eyes as she prepared lessons. Can you teach me to read better? He asked one night, his voice tentative. Pa tries, but he's not very good at it. Eleanor's heart softened. I'd be happy to teach you, Samuel. In fact, you could join my class when I start teaching. The boy's face lit up. Really? Even though I already live here? Especially because you live here, Eleanor said. Everyone deserves an education. On the third morning, Eleanor ventured into William's bedroom to retrieve laundry and noticed something she had missed before. A small wooden box on the dresser, partially hidden behind a lamp. The lid was slightly ajar and a corner of paper protruded from inside. She should not have looked. Eleanor knew that, Privacy was sacred, especially between people still learning to trust each other. But something about that visible edge of paper drew her eye, and before she could think better of it, she had lifted the lid. Inside lay several documents: a deed to the ranch, some bills of sale for cattle, and beneath those a letter from First Bank of Fort Stanton. Eleanor's eyes scanned the page automatically, her teacher's habit of quick reading taking over before her conscience could intervene. Dear Mr. Thornton, this letter serves as formal notice that your loan payment of $800 is due no later than December 25th, 1878. Failure to remit payment in full by this date will result in foreclosure proceedings on the eastern pasture of Thornton Ranch, approximately 160 acres, as stipulated in the original loan agreement. The letter was signed by Silas Blackwood in an elegant, flowing script. Eleanor's hands trembled as she replaced the letter and closed the box carefully. William had told her about the debt, yes, but seeing it in writing, seeing the formal language of foreclosure, and the specific acreage that would be lost made it terrifyingly real. $800, an impossible sum for most people. William worked from dawn to dusk every day and still faced losing part of his land. What chance did he have of paying such a debt while also supporting two additional people? What chance did any of them have? Eleanor finished gathering the laundry and said nothing about what she had found. But the knowledge sat heavy in her chest like a stone. That afternoon, William rode into town. He returned several hours later with packages loaded in his wagon, including something large and heavy wrapped in canvas. Mrs. Margaret, he called as he entered the house. Could you come help me with something? Margaret emerged from the bedroom, curiosity evident in her expression. William had carried the canvas-wrapped object inside and was setting it carefully on the kitchen table. What is this? Margaret asked. William unwrapped it slowly, revealing a sewing machine. Not a new one, but well-maintained, the black iron gleaming with oil. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. I figured it would make your work easier, William said, looking almost embarrassed by her reaction. And I was thinking if you were willing, you could maybe do repairs for folks in town. Extra income, you know, for you both. Mr. Thornton, Margaret's voice shook. This is too much. I haven't had access to a machine since I lost my position at the shop 2 years ago. I can't accept such a gift. It's not a gift, William said firmly. It's an investment. You do good work. People will pay for good work. Seems like a fair business arrangement to me. This practical framing seemed to make it acceptable to Margaret's pride. She nodded, unable to speak, and ran her hands over the machine's smooth surface with something like reverence. Eleanor watched this exchange and felt something shift inside her chest. William had told her he owed $800, had shown her the letter confirming that debt. And yet here he was spending money he could not afford on a sewing machine for her mother. Not because he had to, not because it served him directly, but because he saw a need and chose to meet it. That evening, after Margaret had retired early, exhausted but happy from setting up her new machine, Eleanor found William on the porch. He stood at the railing, looking out over his land as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Can we talk? Eleanor asked quietly. William turned, nodding. Of course. She moved to stand beside him, gathering her courage. I saw the letter from the bank. I wasn't snooping exactly, but I saw it and I read it, and I'm sorry. William was quiet for a moment. It's all right. Nothing in that letter I didn't already tell you about. But the sewing machine. William, you can't afford to be spending money on us. Not when you owe so much. The machine cost $12, William said calmly. Your mother can earn that back in a month if word gets around that there's a skilled seamstress at Thornton Ranch. It's an investment, like I said, not charity. But what if we can't help enough? What if December comes and you still can't pay? William turned to face her fully. Then I'll deal with it. But Ellie, I want you to understand something. I didn't bring you here to solve my problems. I brought you here because I was lonely and I wanted a partner. Someone to build a life with. The debt is my burden, not yours. It could be ours, Eleanor said quietly. If we're to be partners, like you said, partners share burdens. Something flickered in William's eyes, something warm and surprised and pleased. Is that what we're becoming, partners? Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she held his gaze. I'd like to think so. If you're still willing to have me, have us. William reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. When she didn't, he took her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip gentle but firm. "I need to ask you something," he said, "about our arrangement." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "All right. When I put that advertisement in the paper, I was looking for a wife. A real marriage, not just someone to keep house. But I know you came here out of necessity, not because you knew me and chose me, and you've got your mother to think about." He paused, his thumb moving slowly across her knuckles in a gesture that made Eleanor's breath catch. "So here's what I'm putting out my," William continued. "Let's court, properly. Take 2 months to get to know each other without the pressure of expectations hanging over us. At the end of that time, if you think you could be happy as my wife, then I'd be honored to marry you. But if not, the offer of a home still stands. For both of you. No matter what." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. The generosity of it. The sheer decency. "How many men would make such a promise? I would like that," she said softly. "I'd like to be courted, and William. To get to know you better. You've been nothing but kind since we arrived, but you're right that we're still strangers in many ways. I want to change that." The smile that spread across William's face transformed him, making him look younger and lighter. "Then that's what we'll do, and Ellie, maybe when we're alone you could call me Will. I think we're past the point of such formality." "Will," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. She liked it, liked the intimacy of it. "And you should call me Ellie, when it's just us." "Ellie," he said, and the way he said her name, like it was something precious, made her blush. They stood there on the porch, hands clasped, watching the last of the sunset fade into twilight. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and juniper. For the first time since leaving Boston, Eleanor felt something that might have been peace. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in her limited romantic history. There were no formal dances or carefully supervised parlor visits. Instead, there were rides across the ranch with William pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the land. There were evenings on the porch watching the sunset while Margaret sat inside with her sewing, giving them privacy without making them feel like they were doing something improper. There were conversations about everything and nothing, the kind of deep talks that revealed the fundamental nature of a person. Eleanor learned that William had come to New Mexico from Kansas 8 years ago, that his father had been a farmer who drank too much and his mother a quiet woman who had died when William was 12, that he had left home at 16, worked as a ranch hand for years, and saved every penny until he could afford to buy his own land, that he valued honesty above all else, and believed that a person's word was the measure of their character. William learned that Eleanor loved teaching, that she missed it more than she had admitted even to herself, that her father had been a scholar who had fallen from grace due to his radical ideas about education and social reform, that his idealism had left his family impoverished after his death, that Eleanor had inherited both his passion for learning and his stubborn insistence on doing what was right, even when it was not easy. On a bright October morning, Eleanor mentioned casually over breakfast that she missed teaching. William set down his coffee cup. "What if you taught here in Fort Stanton? Town doesn't have a proper school. Most kids don't get any education at all unless their parents can afford to send them east. You could change that." Eleanor felt hope flutter in her chest like a captured bird. "Do you really think people would want me to teach their children, after the way some of them looked at us when we arrived?" "Only one way to find out," William said. "Why don't you ask Ruth Davies? She's got a daughter about 8 years old. If Ruth says yes, others might follow." That afternoon, Eleanor walked into town. It was only 5 miles, but it felt like crossing an ocean. Fort Stanton in daylight was less intimidating than it had been on that first desperate arrival, but Eleanor still felt eyes on her as she made her way down the main street. Ruth Davies's cafe was a modest establishment that served breakfast and lunch to the town's working men. Ruth herself was a sturdy woman in her 40s, with graying brown hair and kind eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. "Miss Carter," Ruth said when Eleanor entered, "what brings you to town?" "I wanted to ask you something, Mrs. Davies, about your daughter." Ruth's expression became guarded. "What about her?" "I was a teacher in Boston. I taught children from poor families. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history. I was wondering if you might consider allowing your daughter to study with me." Ruth studied her for a long moment. "You'd teach Sarah for free." "I would. and any other children whose parents wanted them to learn. Why? It was a fair question. Eleanor chose her words carefully. Because children deserve education, Mrs. Davies. Because the ability to read and write can change a person's life. Because I miss teaching, and I believe I could do some good here. Ruth was quiet, considering. Then she said, Victoria Blackwood won't like it. She's been trying to get a school started for 2 years, but she wants it done her way, with a teacher from back east, someone who meets her standards. I am from back east, Eleanor said. You know what I mean. Someone from her social circle, someone she approves of. Ruth paused. But I don't give a damn what Victoria Blackwood thinks. If you're willing to teach my Sarah, I'm willing to let you try. Relief flooded through Eleanor. Thank you, Mrs. Davies. Call me Ruth and Miss Carter. You're braver than you look. Walking into town alone after the welcome you got, that takes spine. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, Eleanor had 6 students, Ruth's daughter Sarah, 2 boys from families that worked small farms on the outskirts of town, a girl whose father was a ranch hand, 2 siblings whose mother had died and whose father was struggling to raise them alone. William helped Eleanor set up a small classroom in one corner of the barn. It was not much, just some rough benches, a makeshift desk, and a chalkboard he had acquired from somewhere. But it was a start. Eleanor taught 3 mornings a week. She refused to charge money, accepting instead whatever parents could offer. Fresh eggs, milk, sometimes just a thank you. You should be getting paid properly, William argued one evening. They're paying me in what they can afford, Eleanor countered. That's worth more than money to me. Besides, these children need education. Will, it's not right that they should go without just because their families are struggling. William recognized the stubborn set of her jaw. It was the same expression her father had probably worn when advocating for his ideals. The same passion that had gotten him ostracized and impoverished. But William found he could not argue with it, especially when he saw how alive Eleanor became when she was teaching, how her whole face lit up as she worked with her students. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into Eleanor's teaching venture, a visitor arrived at the ranch. Dr. Chen, the Chinese physician, rode up in his small buggy and asked to speak with Margaret. I'm not here in an official capacity, Dr. Chen said when William showed him inside. Well, not exactly. I heard from Ruth Davies that Mrs. Margaret had been a seamstress. My wife, she needs some alterations done. Ruth said your mother might be willing to take on the work. Margaret, who had been setting up her sewing machine in the corner of the main room, looked up. I'd be happy to help, Dr. Chen. Excellent. And while I'm here, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to examine you, just to make sure you're settling in well. The journey from Boston must have been taxing. Margaret glanced at Eleanor, who nodded slightly. That would be kind of you, Doctor. Dr. Chen's examination was thorough but gentle. When he finished, he spoke quietly so only Eleanor and Margaret could hear. You're not dying, Mrs. Margaret. Margaret's eyes widened. What? Your lungs are weak, yes. You have some scarring, probably from a childhood illness. But it's not consumption. It's not heart failure. What you have is chronic anxiety manifesting in physical symptoms. Shortness of breath, fatigue, the coughing. He paused. You're afraid of something. Very afraid. That fear is making you sick. Over the following days, Margaret settled into the rhythm of ranch life. As she began to feel safer, the symptoms began to ease. The coughing fits became less frequent. The bluish tint to her lips faded. She still tired easily, but there was color returning to her cheeks. Eleanor noticed the change with wonder and relief. Her mother was healing. Not because of medicine or doctors, but because, for the first time in months, Margaret felt safe. The human body is remarkable, Dr. Chen said when he visited a week later. Remove the source of fear, provide safety and purpose, and it can heal itself of many ailments. Margaret was sitting at her sewing machine, humming as she worked. She looked up and smiled at the doctor. I feel more alive than I have in years, Dr. Chen. This place, these people, they've given me my life back. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. Doctor, I don't know what you mean. Dr. Chen looked at her with eyes that were far too knowing. I've been in this country for 30 years, Miss Eleanor. I came here as a young man fleeing persecution in my homeland. I know what it looks like when someone is running from something, and I know what it looks like when the fear catches up. He packed his medical bag carefully. I won't ask questions. That's not my place. But I want you both to know that if you need help, if you need someone who understands what it means to be hunted, you can trust me. Your secret, whatever it is safe. After he left, Eleanor and Margaret sat in silence for a long time. He knows, Margaret said finally, or at least suspects. But he won't tell. I believe him. Do you think we should tell William the whole truth? Eleanor considered this. They had been at the ranch for 2 weeks now. William had been nothing but kind, nothing but generous. He deserved honesty, but the truth was so ugly, so dangerous. If William knew that Margaret was wanted for murder, that Eleanor had brought a fugitive into his home, would he still want them there? Would he still want to court Eleanor? Not yet, Eleanor said quietly. Let's wait a little longer. Make sure he really means what he said. Make sure this is real. It was cowardice, perhaps, but it was also survival. The following Sunday, William took Eleanor and Margaret to church. It was their first public appearance as a unit since that initial arrival, and Eleanor dressed carefully in her best dress, which Margaret had altered to fit better. The small church was already half full when they arrived. Conversation stopped as they walked down the aisle. Eleanor felt every eye on them, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity. William seemed unbothered. He led them to a pew near the middle, helped Margaret sit, then settled beside Eleanor with his shoulder touching hers in a gesture of quiet solidarity. The service began. Reverend Morris was a middle-aged man with a kind face and a voice that carried well in the small space. His sermon was about accepting strangers, about showing mercy to those in need. Eleanor wondered if he had chosen the topic deliberately, if Ruth Davies had perhaps mentioned Eleanor's teaching to the Reverend and prompted this particular message. But then Reverend Morris pivoted. Of course, he said, we must also practice discernment. Not every stranger who arrives in our midst comes with pure intentions. We must be wise as serpents, even as we are gentle as doves. Eleanor felt her stomach clench. Across the church, she saw Victoria Blackwood sitting in the front pew, nodding approvingly. After the service, as people gathered outside in the sunshine, Victoria made her approach. She was dressed impeccably as always. A dress of emerald green that probably cost more than Eleanor had earned in 6 months of teaching. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her smile was perfectly polite, and her eyes were perfectly cold. Miss Carter, Victoria said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the cluster of women nearby. How wonderful to see you at services. And Mrs. Carter, you are looking, well, better than when you arrived. Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood, Eleanor said evenly. I heard you've been teaching some of our local children. How enterprising of you. I enjoy teaching. I'm sure you do. Victoria's smile sharpened, though I do wonder about your qualifications. Where did you say you studied? I didn't say, but I attended the Boston Normal School for 2 years before financial circumstances required me to seek employment. The normal school? How adequate. Victoria glanced at the women around her, making sure they were paying attention. And your family, Miss Carter? What did your father do? It was a trap, and Eleanor knew it. Victoria wanted her to say that her father had been a scholar because then Victoria could ask where he taught, what his credentials were, whether he published. And when Eleanor revealed that her father had been a radical reformer who died in poverty, Victoria would use it to undermine her credibility. But before Eleanor could answer, William stepped forward. Her father was a man who believed in education for all, Mrs. Blackwood. Not just for those who could afford it. I'd say that's about the best qualification a teacher could have. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Of course, Mr. Thornton, I meant no offense. I'm simply concerned about the quality of education our children receive. Then you should talk to Ruth Davies, or Tom Crawford, or any of the other parents whose children Ellie's been teaching. They'll tell you about quality. A murmur went through the gathered women. Some looked impressed. Others looked uncertain. Victoria's grip on social power was strong, but William's words carried weight too. He was respected in Fort Stanton, a landowner, a man who kept his word and paid his debts. Well paid his debts when he could. Victoria seemed to recognize that she was losing ground. She inclined her head graciously. I'm sure you're right, Mr. Thornton. I look forward to seeing the fruits of Miss Carter's labor. She glided away, her companions following. But Eleanor caught the look in her eyes as she departed. This was not over. Victoria Blackwood had been challenged in front of her social circle, And women like Victoria did not forgive such slights easily. On the ride home, Margaret was quiet, too quiet. When they arrived at the ranch, she went immediately to lie down, claiming exhaustion. Eleanor followed her into the bedroom. Mama, what's wrong? Well, Margaret's face was pale. I saw him. Saw who? The man from Boston. The one who, she swallowed hard. The one who came after me. After we saw what we saw. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Are you sure? I'm sure he was standing at the back of the church. Tall brown suit scar on his left cheek. I'd never forget that face. Margaret gripped Eleanor's hand. He's here, Ellie. He's found us. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to her mother's breathing, and wondered how much time they had left. If the man from Boston was here, if he had followed them to Fort Stanton, then it was only a matter of time before he made his move, before he revealed Margaret's supposed crime, before everything they had been building here collapsed. Eleanor thought about William's kindness, about the courtship they had barely begun, about the students who were finally learning to read. She thought about how much she stood to lose, and she thought about the one thing she had not told William. The one piece of truth she had held back even as he shared his own vulnerabilities. Her mother was not just sick, her mother was wanted for murder. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and ran to the window. In the early dawn light, she could see flames rising from the barn, from the corner where she had set up her makeshift classroom. For to hire, she screamed. El puesto. William was out of the bunkhouse in seconds, already moving. The ranch hands appeared from their quarters. Margaret stumbled from the bedroom, coughing. Eleanor ran outside in her nightgown and wrapper, not caring about propriety. The fire was spreading fast, consuming the dry wood of the barn's interior. William and the hands formed a bucket brigade from the well. They worked frantically, desperately, but Eleanor could already see it was too late. The classroom section was destroyed. The books she had carefully collected, the slates, the benches William had built, well, all going up in flames. By the time they got the fire under control, the sun had risen fully. The barn still stood, but the classroom corner was a blackened ruin. Sheriff Reeves arrived an hour later, summoned by one of the ranch hands. He examined the scene carefully, then turned to William with a grim expression. Arson, he said flatly. Someone poured kerosene along the wall, then lit it. You can see where it started. Eleanor felt sick. Who would do this? Reeves looked toward town, his weathered face troubled. Someone who doesn't want you teaching Miss Eleanor. That's clear enough. William's hands clenched into fists. Victoria. Can't prove it was Victoria directly, Reeves said, but I found fresh boot prints near the kerosene cans. Size 11, same as one of Silas's ranch hands. Man named Tucker, who's known to do odd jobs for the Blackwoods when they need something done quiet-like. But someone did. Someone who wanted to send a message. Eleanor sank down onto a hay bale that had escaped the flames. All her work, all those children's hopes, gone. But then around mid-morning, something remarkable happened. Ruth Davies arrived in her wagon bringing lumber. Heard about the fire, figured you'd need to rebuild. Tom Crawford came next with his sons. We'll help. Then more families, parents of the children Eleanor had been teaching. They brought tools, nails, paint. Even families who had been uncertain about Eleanor's teaching showed up offering what they could. By sunset, a new classroom stood. Not perfect, but functional. Better than before in some ways. Larger, sturdier. Eleanor stood in the middle of it, tears streaming down her face, as Ruth Davies handed her a slate board. This is from all of us, Ruth said. You keep teaching our kids, Miss Eleanor. Don't let whoever did this win. William found Eleanor that evening sitting on the porch steps, exhausted, but somehow lighter than she had been in days. The community came through, he said, settling beside her. They did. You've made a difference here, Ellie, in just a few weeks. People see that. They value it. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder without thinking, then stiffened slightly, wondering if she was being too forward. But William shifted to accommodate her weight, his arm coming around her shoulders in a gesture that felt natural and right. Will, she said quietly, I need to tell you something about why we really left Boston. He was silent, waiting. My mother didn't just fall ill. She was accused of something terrible. Eleanor took a breath and told him about Thomas Whitmore, the wealthy factory owner, about Margaret working late one night and witnessing something she shouldn't have. About the murder, the frame up the detective at their door. About the fact that Margaret Carter was wanted for a crime she swore she did not commit. William listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Do you believe her?" he asked finally. "That she didn't do it?" "With every fiber of my being." "Then I believe her too." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him. "Just like that. Just like that." William met her gaze steadily. "I've gotten to know your mother these past weeks. She's one of the kindest, gentlest people I've ever met. I don't believe she's a murderer, and I don't believe you'd protect her if she was. But if someone finds out if that man she saw at church reports back to Boston, then we'll deal with it, together." William's hand found hers. "That's what you said, isn't it? That partners share burdens." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes again. "You're not angry that I didn't tell you sooner. I figure you had your reasons. Trust takes time, Ellie. I understand that." They sat in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, and Eleanor felt the weight of her secret lift slightly. Not gone, but shared now. Carried by two instead of one. She did not see the figure watching from the ridge again. Did not know that Detective Marcus Flynn was at that very moment checking into the Fort Stanton Hotel, carrying a warrant with Margaret Carter's name on it. Did not know that Silas Blackwood had sent a telegram to Boston 3 days ago offering information about a fugitive's whereabouts in exchange for a fee. Did not know that the relative peace they had found was about to shatter completely. But she would find out soon enough. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would test everything they had built, would force choices that could not be unmade, would prove whether the fragile trust between them was strong enough to withstand the storm that was coming. For now, though, there was this: the quiet evening, the warmth of William's presence beside her, the knowledge that she was not alone anymore. For now, that was enough. Detective Marcus Flynn arrived in Fort Stanton on a Thursday morning, carrying a leather satchel and the kind of certainty that came from years of tracking fugitives. He was a tall man in his 40s, wearing a brown suit that hung oddly on his lean frame, and he moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who did not waste time on pleasantries. His first stop was the sheriff's office. Jacob Reeves looked up from his desk as Flynn entered, his weathered face neutral, but his eyes sharp. Reeves had been a lawman for 30 years, long enough to recognize trouble when it walked through his door. "Help you?" Reeves asked. Flynn reached into his satchel and pulled out a stack of papers. "Detective Marcus Flynn, working on behalf of the Boston Police Department. I'm hunting a fugitive, believed to be in this area." He placed a wanted poster on Reeves's desk. The woodcut illustration was crude but recognizable. Margaret Carter, wanted for the murder of Thomas Whitmore. Reward $500. Reeves studied the poster without touching it. Murder, that's serious business. She killed her employer 6 months ago, stabbed him in his own factory. We have witnesses who saw her running from the scene, blood on her dress. Witnesses? Reeves made it sound like a question. Multiple witnesses, reliable people. And you think she's here in Fort Stanton? Flynn's eyes gleamed. I know she is. I saw her myself. 3 days ago, at the church service. Old woman, silver hair, about 64. She was sitting with a younger woman and a rancher. Reeves kept his expression carefully neutral. Saw a lot of people at church Sunday. Can't say I remember everyone. This woman would stand out. She looked sick, weak, like she won't last long. Flynn leaned forward. Sheriff, I'm not asking for your help out of courtesy. I have a warrant. He placed another document on the desk, signed by a federal judge. I have the authority to arrest Margaret Carter and return her to Boston for trial. Reeves picked up the warrant and read it slowly. Every word. When he finished, he set it down with deliberate care. Warrant looks legal, he admitted, but I can't help you find someone I haven't seen. Flynn's jaw tightened. You're obstructing justice, Sheriff. I'm saying I need more to go on than a description. You got any other evidence she's here? I saw her with my own eyes. And I see a lot of people every day. Memory's not what it used to be. Reeves stood, ending the conversation. You want to look around town, ask questions, that's your right. But unless you can prove this woman's here, I got nothing for you. Flynn stared at him for a long moment, then gathered his papers. I'll find her, Sheriff, with or without your help. And when I do, I'll remember who stood in my way. After Flynn left, Reeves sat down heavily. He knew exactly who the man was talking about. Margaret Carter, who was living at the Thornton Ranch. Margaret, who was kind and gentle and had taught his wife a new stitch for her quilting just last week. Margaret, who was apparently wanted for murder. Reeves had a decision to make: enforce the law as written or trust his instincts about people. And his instincts told him that Margaret Carter was no more a murderer than he was. But instincts wouldn't hold up against a federal warrant. He needed to warn William. Fast. At the ranch, Eleanor was teaching her morning class when she saw the dust cloud approaching. Her students noticed too, their attention drifting from the arithmetic lesson to the window. "Miss Ellie," young Sarah Davies said, "someone's coming." Eleanor set down the chalk and stepped outside. Sheriff Reeves was riding hard, his horse lathered with sweat. Behind him, still distant but getting closer, she could see another rider. Reeves pulled up and dismounted quickly. "Where's William?" "In the north pasture." "What's wrong?" "Detective from Boston showed up. Name's Flynn. He's got a warrant for your mother." Eleanor's world tilted. "How did he find us?" "Don't know, but he's here and he's got legal authority to arrest her." Reeves glanced back toward town. "I slowed him down as much as I could, but he'll be out here soon. Maybe an hour." Eleanor's mind raced. They could run, pack what they could carry, and disappear into the vast New Mexico landscape. But Margaret was too weak for another long journey, and running would only confirm their guilt. "I need to tell Will," Eleanor said. "Already sent one of my deputies to find him. But Miss Eleanor, you need to prepare your mother. This is happening, and there's not much any of us can do to stop it." Eleanor dismissed her students quickly, sending them home with assurances that class would resume soon. Then she went inside to find Margaret sitting at her sewing machine, humming softly as she worked on a dress for Victoria Blackwood, of all people. "Mama," Eleanor said gently, "we need to talk." Margaret looked up, and in her eyes Eleanor saw that she already knew. Perhaps she had always known this moment would come. "The detective," Margaret said. It was not a question. "He's here. He has a warrant. Sheriff Reeves says there's nothing he can do." Margaret set down her sewing with hands that trembled only slightly. "Then it's time, I suppose. Time to stop running." "No, we can leave right now. Will would help us." "I know he would." "And make him a criminal, too. Make him lose everything." Margaret shook her head. "No, Eleanor, I won't do that to him. To either of you." "But you're innocent." "I know that, you know that, but proving it—" Margaret's voice cracked. "How do we prove I didn't kill a man when all the evidence says I did?" Eleanor heard hoofbeats outside. Multiple horses. She looked through the window and saw William riding up with two ranch hands, his face set in grim lines. Behind him, approaching from the direction of town, was another rider, Detective Flynn. William dismounted and strode into the house. His eyes found Eleanor's immediately. "How much time do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less." William turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Margaret, I want you to know that I don't believe you killed anyone. Neither does Ellie. Whatever happens next, we're with you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You're a good man, William Thornton. Better than I had any right to hope for." Flynn arrived with Sheriff Reeves trailing behind him, looking distinctly unhappy about the situation. The detective dismounted and walked to the porch with the confidence of someone who held all the legal cards. "Margaret Carter," Flynn announced, "I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Thomas Whitmore. You'll come with me back to Boston to stand trial." Margaret stood slowly with dignity. "I understand." "No," William stepped forward, placing himself between Flynn and Margaret. "She's not going anywhere." Flynn's hand moved to the gun at his hip. "That's obstruction, Mr. Thornton. I can arrest you too." "You can try." The ranch hands moved to flank William, their hands near their own weapons. The air crackled with tension. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Sheriff Reeves stepped forward, his voice carrying authority. "Everyone calm down. Flynn, you got your warrant, but let's talk about this There's nothing to talk about," Flynn said. "I'm taking the fugitive back to Boston." "That's the law." "Maybe so," Reeves said slowly. "But I just got a telegram right before I rode out here." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "From the Boston Police Department. Seems there's been some new developments in the Whitmore case. New evidence under review. They're asking all officers to hold off on arrests until the investigation is complete." Flynn's eyes narrowed. That's not possible. I would have been notified. Well, you're being notified now. Reeves held out the telegram. Flynn snatched it and read quickly. His face darkened. This doesn't change anything. The warrant is still valid. For 48 hours, you're to hold off. That's what it says. 48 hours while they review the new evidence. It was a lie. Eleanor could see it in Reeves's face and the slight tension around his eyes. There was no telegram, or if there was, it said nothing about holding off. But Flynn couldn't be sure. Not without riding back to town and checking with the telegraph office. Flynn stared at Reeves, clearly torn between his desire to make the arrest and the risk of violating orders. 48 hours, Flynn said finally. But she doesn't leave this ranch. And if she runs, all of you are accessories. Flynn hesitated, clearly wanting to verify the telegram, but Reeves added quickly, the telegraph office is closed for repairs until tomorrow. Lightning strike took out the line yesterday. You're welcome to wait in town if you want, but that's the situation. It was another lie, but Flynn had no way to confirm it immediately. He would discover the deception eventually, but by then they would have the evidence they needed. She won't run, William said firmly. Flynn remounted his horse. I'll be back. You can count on it. He rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The moment he was out of sight, Reeves turned to William. You've got 48 hours, maybe less if he checks with the telegraph office and realizes I was bluffing. 48 hours to do what? Eleanor asked. To find the truth, William said. The real truth about what happened in Boston. That night, the house became a war room. William, Eleanor, Margaret, Dr. Chen, and Sheriff Reeves sat around the kitchen table trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Margaret told them everything. About Thomas Whitmore, the factory owner who had employed her as a seamstress. About working late one night to finish a rush order. About hearing raised voices from Whitmore's office. I thought he was alone, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. But there were two men arguing. I recognized Whitmore's voice. The other was someone I'd heard before but couldn't place it first. What were they arguing about? Dr. Chen asked. Money. Stolen money. Whitmore was accusing the other man of embezzlement. Said he had proof. Said he was going to the police. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering. Then I heard a sound, a thud, and Whitmore screamed, just once. Then silence. You saw the killer, William asked. I saw his shadow through the frosted glass. Tall, well-dressed. He walked right past where I was hiding behind some fabric bolts. Never saw me, but I saw him clearly when he turned toward the lamplight. Who was it? Eleanor prompted gently. A man named Jonathan Hale, Whitmore's business partner. Margaret opened her eyes, but 2 days later, Hale told the police he'd seen me running from the factory covered in blood, that I'd stolen money from the safe, that I must have killed Whitmore when he discovered the theft. And they believed him over you, Reeves said. I was just a seamstress. He was a respectable businessman. Of course they believed him. Dr. Chen leaned forward. What happened to Hale? I don't know. We fled before I could find out. William stood and began pacing. We need to prove Hale killed Whitmore, or at least create enough doubt about Margaret's guilt that Boston will drop the charges. How? Eleanor asked. We're in New Mexico. The crime happened in Boston. All the evidence is there. Then we get the evidence, William said. Telegraph letters, whatever it takes. Reeves shook his head. Flynn will be watching. Any telegrams you send, he'll see. What if someone else sent them? Dr. Chen suggested. Someone Flynn wouldn't suspect. All eyes turned to him. I have contacts, Dr. Chen said quietly. People in my community, Chinese workers in Boston. They're invisible to men like Flynn. They can ask questions, find information, send telegrams without drawing attention. Would they help? Eleanor asked. For a price, but yes, I believe they would. William didn't hesitate. Name it. Over the next 2 days, a flurry of coded telegrams went back and forth. Dr. Chen's contacts in Boston began digging into Jonathan Hale's background, into his business dealings with Whitmore, into what had happened after Margaret fled. What they discovered was damning. Hale had not just accused Margaret of murder, he had also taken over Whitmore's business, using the chaos after the murder to seize control of the factory and all its assets. He had paid off debts Whitmore owed Consolidated Power, and within 2 months become one of Boston's most successful textile manufacturers. But more importantly, 3 months after Whitmore's death, Jonathan Hale himself had died. The official cause suicide. He had supposedly jumped from a window of his office building. But one of Dr. Chen's contacts at a cleaning woman who had worked in Hale's building told a different story. She had seen two men visit Hale the night before his death. Business associates from out west, she said. They had argued with Hale for hours. The next morning, Hale was dead. Someone silenced him, William said, reading the telegram. Someone who wanted to make sure he never told the truth about Whitmore's murder. But who? Eleanor asked. The answer came from an unexpected source. Margaret, looking through the wanted poster Flynn had left behind, noticed something in the fine print at the bottom. Reward to be paid by Blackwood Financial Services, she read aloud. Then her face went pale. Blackwood, that was the name. The man Hale was doing business with. Silas Blackwood. The room went silent. Silas Blackwood, Reeves said slowly. Our Silas Blackwood. It's not a common name, Dr. Chen observed. William's jaw clenched. Silas has been in New Mexico for 10 years. He came from back east. Boston, I think someone said once. Eleanor felt pieces clicking into place. Silas offers a reward for information about Mama. Flynn shows up days later. Silas knew. He's been looking for her. But why? Margaret asked. I never saw him. I only saw Hale. Maybe Silas was the third man, William said. The business associate from out west who visited Hale before he died. Maybe Silas killed Whitmore or had him killed. Hale was the fall guy, and when Hale got nervous, Silas eliminated him too. But what's the connection? Reeves asked. What business would a Boston factory owner have with a New Mexico banker? Dr. Chen's next telegram provided the answer. One of his contacts had found old business records. Whitmore had been investing in Western expansion, buying land, financing mining operations. His business partner in these ventures had been a young banker named Silas Blackwood. But Whitmore had discovered that Blackwood was embezzling from their joint accounts, using the money to fund his own operations. Whitmore had threatened to expose him, so Blackwood had him killed, framed Margaret, used Hale as the murderer and scapegoat. Then when Hale became a liability, eliminated him too. We have to prove it, Eleanor said. We have to show Flynn that Mama was framed. But proving it would require something they didn't have. Physical evidence, testimony, something more than conjecture based on old business records and hearsay. William stood abruptly. I'm going to talk to Silas directly. That's a bad idea, Reeves warned. If he's killed 3 people, he won't hesitate to kill you too. I'm not going to threaten him. I'm going to make him think I want to deal. Trade Margaret for my debt. Eleanor grabbed his arm. Will, no. You can't. I can and I will. It's the only way to get him to talk. If he thinks he's won, he might let something slip. The confrontation happened at the bank the next morning. William walked in alone, his hat in his hands, his expression that of a defeated man. Silas looked up from his desk, a smile spreading across his face. Thornton, come to beg for an extension. Come to offer you something better, William said. Information. What kind of information? The kind that's worth $500, maybe more. Silas's eyes gleamed with interest. Go on. Margaret Carter. The woman living at my ranch. She's wanted in Boston. Murder charge. Big reward for information leading to her capture. I'm aware, Silas said carefully. I figure you're the one who brought Flynn here. You're the one who wants her found. William paused. I want to know why. Silas laughed. Why do I need a reason? $500 is reason enough. Not for you. You've got more money than you know what to do with. This is personal. William leaned forward. What did Margaret Carter see Silas? What are you so afraid she'll remember? For just a moment, Silas's mask slipped. William saw fear flash across his face before the banker recovered his composure. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You killed Thomas Whitmore, or had him killed. Margaret saw something that night, something that could connect you to the crime. Silas stood slowly. You're making dangerous accusations, Thornton. I'm stating facts. You were Whitmore's business partner. You embezzled from him. He found out. So you killed him and framed an innocent woman. You can't prove any of that. Maybe not yet, but Margaret's starting to remember. Details she didn't think were important, like the business papers she saw on Whitmore's desk. Papers with your name on them. It was a bluff, but it worked. Silas's face darkened. Even if any of this were true, which it's not, what do you want? Forget my debt, all of it, $800 erased. And I'll make sure Margaret Carter gets on that train with Flynn and never says a word about what she saw. Silas studied him for a long moment. You'd sell her out to save your land. I'd do whatever it takes to survive, just like you. Let me think about it, Silas said. Come back tomorrow. William left the bank and rode straight to the sheriff's office where Reeves was waiting with a grim expression. He basically admitted it, William said, the fear in his eyes when I mentioned the business papers. He knows Margaret can connect him to Whitmore. Admitting it to you in private doesn't help us, Reeves pointed out. We need proof, evidence that will hold up. Then we get it. William's jaw set with determination. Tonight. The plan was dangerous and probably illegal, but they were out of options. While Silas was at dinner with Victoria at the hotel restaurant, William, Eleanor, and Dr. Chen would break into the bank and search for evidence. This is insane, Eleanor whispered, as they approached the bank under cover of darkness. It's necessary, William countered. Dr. Chen had the lock picked in under a minute, a skill he claimed to have learned as a young man in San Francisco. They slipped inside, closing the door carefully behind them. Silas's office was in the back. William lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. They began searching through files, looking for anything that connected Silas to Boston, to Whitmore, to the murder. They found it in a locked drawer in Silas's desk. More proof of Dr. Chen's unexpected skills with locks. Inside were letters, correspondence between Silas and Jonathan Hale dating back 5 years. Discussion of embezzlement, of hiding funds of Whitmore becoming suspicious. And one letter dated 2 weeks before Whitmore's murder that was unmistakable in its intent. We must act soon, Hale had written. Whitmore knows too much. The witness must be eliminated. I will handle the factory owner. You ensure there are no loose ends. The witness? Margaret. He ordered her death, Eleanor breathed, before Whitmore was even killed. He knew she'd seen something. This is it, William said, gathering the letters. This is what we need. But as they turned to leave, they heard the front door of the bank open. Footsteps. Multiple people. William doused the lantern immediately. In the darkness, Eleanor's hand found his. They held their breath listening. I'm telling you, I saw movement inside, a man's voice said. Not Silas, one of his employees. Probably just shadows, another voice replied. But let's check to be sure. William, Eleanor, and Dr. Chen pressed against the wall behind Silas's desk, trapped. If they were discovered now, breaking into the bank, they'd be arrested. All their evidence would be dismissed as forgeries, products of desperate criminals. The footsteps came closer. A light appeared in the hallway. Then from outside, a loud crash, shouting, the sound of horses panicking. What the hell? The footsteps retreated quickly. Come on. The men ran outside to investigate the disturbance. William didn't waste the opportunity. He grabbed Eleanor and Dr. Chen, and they slipped out through the back door just as Sheriff Reeves appeared grinning. Thought you might need a distraction, Reeves said. Knocked over some barrels, spooked the horses. You get what you needed. William held up the letters. We got it. The next morning before going to Flynn, they made one crucial stop. Victoria Blackwood sat in Ruth Davies's cafe, her face pale but resolute. She signed a document that Dr. Chen had prepared, her hand steady despite everything. This states that as co-owner of Blackwood Financial Services, you gave permission for these individuals to access your husband's office for the purpose of retrieving personal documents, Dr. Chen explained. The date is backdated to yesterday evening before the actual search occurred. Victoria didn't hesitate. Where do I sign? It was a legal fiction, but a necessary one. Without it, everything they'd found would be worthless in court. An hour later, they presented both the letters and Victoria's signed authorization to Detective Flynn at his hotel. Flynn read the letters with an expression that shifted from skepticism to shock to grim satisfaction. He examined Victoria's authorization carefully. Mrs. Blackwood gave you permission to search her husband's private office, Flynn asked skeptically. She did. Dr. Chen confirmed, showing the signed and dated document. As joint owner of the bank, she has that legal right. Flynn studied the authorization, clearly suspicious of the convenient timing, but unable to prove it was backdated. Finally, he nodded. When he finished, he looked up at Margaret. Mrs. Carter, it appears you've been telling the truth. These letters indicate a conspiracy between Silas Blackwood and Jonathan Hale to murder Thomas Whitmore and frame you for the crime. Does this mean she's free? Eleanor asked. It means the charges against her should be dropped, yes. But I'll need to verify these documents, send them to Boston for authentication. How long will that take? William asked. A week, maybe two. And in the meantime, Margaret is still wanted, Reeves said. Flynn hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. In light of this new evidence, I'm prepared to delay enforcement of the warrant. Mrs. Carter, you'll remain in Sheriff Reeves's custody until we hear back from Boston. She can stay at my ranch, William said firmly, under house arrest if you need to call it that. But she's not going to a cell. Flynn looked like he wanted to argue, but Reeves cut in. That seems reasonable. I'll check on her daily. Make sure she hasn't fled. Fine, Flynn said, but Blackwood needs to be arrested immediately. On what charges? Reeves asked. We broke into his bank to get these letters. Any lawyer will argue they're inadmissible. Then we need him to confess, Flynn said, or we need more evidence that we obtained legally. I might have an idea about that, William said. The plan required one person willing to take a terrible risk, someone Silas would never suspect, someone who had access to him, to his private papers, to his home. Victoria Blackwood. She'll never help us, Eleanor said, when William suggested it. She's loyal to Silas. Is she? William asked. Or is she loyal to her position, her status, her reputation? Because if Silas goes down for murder, all of that goes with him. It was Ruth Davies who made the approach. She and Victoria had been friends once before. Victoria's marriage to Silas had elevated her social status beyond Ruth's reach. But there were still threads of connection, memories of a simpler time. Ruth found Victoria in the church arranging flowers for Sunday service. Victoria, we need to talk, Ruth said without preamble, about your husband. Victoria's face became a mask of cool politeness. I don't discuss my marriage with you, Ruth. Not your marriage, his crimes. That got Victoria's attention. She set down the flowers carefully. What are you talking about? Ruth told her everything. About Margaret, about Whitmore, about the letters they had found, about Silas's involvement in murder and embezzlement. Victoria's face went pale. That's impossible. Silas is a respected businessman. Silas is a murderer who's been hiding behind respectability for years. And when this comes out, and it will come out, you'll be destroyed along with him. Unless you help us. Help you do what? Help us get a confession? Or find more evidence. Something that proves his guilt beyond any doubt. Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then she said, What do you need me to do? That night at the Blackwood home, Victoria suggested to her husband that they host a dinner party, a small gathering. Just the sheriff, the detective, and a few other prominent citizens. To show we have nothing to hide, Victoria said, to demonstrate that we're cooperative and transparent. Silas was suspicious at first, but Victoria knew how to manage him, knew how to appeal to his vanity, his desire to appear magnanimous and in control. He agreed. The plan was set. Victoria would search Silas's study during a dinner party she would host in 2 days' time. That would give them time to prepare to ensure every detail was in place. And while Silas was busy playing the gracious host, Victoria would search his private study for more evidence of his crimes. But things went wrong before the dinner even began. That afternoon, 3 men rode up to the Thornton Ranch, hard-looking men with guns on their hips and cruelty in their eyes. The leader, a man with a scar across his left cheek, was someone Margaret recognized immediately. Kane, she whispered, her face draining of color. He's one of Hale's men. After the murder, he came to my boarding house, threatened me, told me to keep quiet or I'd end up like Whitmore. Her voice shook. That's when we knew we had to run. When we saw him at the church, I knew they'd found us. William stepped outside to confront them. You're on my land. State your business or leave. Kane smiled, showing yellow teeth. We're here for the old woman. Mr. Blackwood sent us to collect her. She's under Sheriff Reeves's protection. You've got no authority here. We've got all the authority we need. Kane pulled his gun. Now step aside or we'll go through you. The ranch hands moved to flank William, their own weapons drawn. For a moment, it seemed like violence was inevitable. The ranch hands moved to flank William, their own weapons drawn. For a moment, it seemed like violence was inevitable. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, Margaret behind her. She could see William's jaw set, could see the calculation in Kane's eyes. Kane pulled his gun and aimed it directly at William. Eleanor didn't think. She ran. Her feet carried her across the dirt yard faster than she'd ever moved in her life. She reached William just as Kane's finger tightened on the trigger. No, she screamed, throwing herself in front of her husband. The gunshot cracked like thunder. Eleanor felt the impact, a burning sensation along her ribs that stole her breath. The world tilted. She was falling. William caught her before she hit the ground. Ellie, Ellie! A second gunshot rang out. Sheriff Reeves emerging from the barn where he had been keeping watch. His bullet took Kane in the shoulder, spinning the gunman around and sending his weapon flying. The other two men froze, looking at their fallen leader. Reeves cocked his rifle. Next one goes in ahead, Reeves said calmly. Your choice, boys. They ran, mounting their horses and riding hard toward town, leaving Kane bleeding in the dirt. Dr. Chen rushed from the house, already carrying his medical bag. He knelt beside Eleanor, his hands moving quickly. Let me see, he said urgently. William's hands were shaking as he helped Dr. Chen examine the wound. Blood stained Eleanor's dress along her right side. The bullet grazed her ribs, Dr. Chen said after a tense moment. Painful but not fatal. She'll need stitches, but she'll live. William's head dropped forward in relief. Thank God. Thank God. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. Will, I'm here. You're going to be fine. His voice broke. You crazy, beautiful fool. You jumped in front of a gun. Couldn't let him shoot you, Eleanor whispered. You're my husband. Despite the pain, despite the fear still coursing through him, William laughed. It was a sound edged with hysteria and relief. You're my wife, and you're never doing anything like that again. Can't promise that, Eleanor said, managing a weak smile. Margaret appeared, her face pale with terror. Eleanor, I'm all right, Mama. Dr. Chen says I'll be fine. As they carried Eleanor inside for Dr. Chen to properly treat the wound, Samuel emerged from where he'd been hiding inside. His young face was tearful. Miss Ellie got hurt because of us, he said to Margaret. Margaret pulled the boy close. No, child. Miss Ellie got hurt because she loves your pa. That's what people do when they love someone. They protect them. But Margaret, watching from the doorway, knew this was only the beginning. Silas had tried to take her by force. He would try again. And next time he might succeed. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to her mother's breathing, and thought about how quickly everything could be lost, how fragile their safety truly was. She thought about William, about the courtship they had barely begun, about the life they were trying to build in the shadow of violence and fear. And she thought about tomorrow night's dinner party, about Victoria's plan to search Silas's study, about all the ways it could go wrong. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went outside. She found William on the porch, sitting on the steps staring at the stars. Couldn't sleep either, he asked. Too much to think about. Eleanor sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. They stayed that way for a while, drawing comfort from proximity. I'm scared, Will, Eleanor finally admitted. Not for me, for Mama, for you, for Samuel. All of this is because of us, because we came here. Don't, William said firmly. Don't do that. You came here because you had nowhere else to go. What Silas did, what is happening now, that's on him, not you. But if we hadn't come, if I hadn't answered your ad, you'd be safe. You wouldn't be in danger of losing your land or getting shot or any of this. William turned to face her fully. Ellie, before you came, I was surviving. Working myself to death on this ranch, going to bed alone every night, waking up to the same empty house. I was existing, not living. He took her hand. You changed that, you and Margaret. You brought life back to this place, to me. I'll take danger over emptiness any day. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. How can you say that? We've brought you nothing but trouble. You've brought me hope. You've brought me a future worth fighting for. William's other hand came up to cup her face gently. I'm falling in love with you, Ellie. Maybe I already have. And if that means fighting Silas Blackwood, if that means risking everything I own, then so be it. Some things are worth the risk. Eleanor couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only stare at him in the starlight as her heart hammered against her ribs. I know it's too soon, William continued. I know we agreed to take our time, but I need you to know how I feel. Need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow night or the next day or the day after that, I'm with you all the way. Will, Eleanor whispered, I love you too. The kiss was inevitable, slow and sweet and filled with everything they hadn't yet said. Eleanor's hands came up to grip William's shirt, anchoring herself to him, to this moment, to the promise of something beautiful emerging from chaos. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, William rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not 2 months from now. Not when all this is over. Now, tomorrow, as soon as we can get Reverend Morris out here." "Well, we can't, not with everything that's happening. Especially with everything that's happening. Ellie, life is uncertain. The future is never guaranteed. I don't want to waste another day being anything less than your husband." Eleanor thought about all the reasons to say no. The danger, the uncertainty, the very real possibility that tomorrow might bring disaster. Then she thought about all the reasons to say yes, the way William looked at her, the safety she felt in his arms, the future they could build together if they were brave enough to reach for it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed 3 days later in the small parlor of the ranch house. Eleanor's wound was still tender, but Dr. Chen had pronounced her well enough for the ceremony. Eleanor wore a simple dress that Margaret had altered to fit her better. William wore his best shirt and the suit he usually reserved for funerals. They spoke their vows with voices that shook but never faltered. "I, William, take you, Eleanor, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part. I, Eleanor, take you, William, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part." When Reverend Morris pronounced them husband and wife, when William kissed her in front of their small assembly of loved ones, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. A certainty, a rightness. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The dinner party at the Blackwood home that evening was an exercise in tension and false civility. Victoria played the perfect hostess, her smile never wavering, even as her hands trembled slightly when pouring wine. Silas held court at the head of the table, regaling his guests with stories of business triumphs and frontier adventures. He was charming and confident, showing no sign of the monster beneath the surface. Detective Flynn watched him with narrowed eyes. Sheriff Reeves asked pointed questions that Silas deflected with practiced ease. Midway through the meal, Victoria excused herself to check on dessert. Instead, she slipped into Silas's study and began searching his desk. She found more letters, more evidence of embezzlement and fraud. And she found something else. A telegram sent just 2 days ago to an address in Santa Fe. "Target acquired. Eliminate witness. Payment on completion." Victoria's hands shook as she folded the telegram and slipped it into her bodice. This was it. Proof that Silas had ordered Margaret's death. Proof that her husband was a murderer. She returned to the dining room just as Silas was finishing a story about his first years in New Mexico. He smiled at her, and for the first time in their marriage, Victoria saw him clearly. Saw the coldness behind his charm, the calculation behind his generosity. Saw the man who had killed for money and would kill again without hesitation. After the guests departed, Victoria waited until Silas had retired to his study. Then she walked out of the house and directly to Sheriff Reeves's office. "I have evidence," she said, handing him the telegram. "My husband tried to have Margaret Carter killed. This proves it." Reeves read the telegram, his expression grim. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you sure about this? Once you testify against your husband, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Victoria's voice was steady. "I married a businessman. I didn't marry a murderer. Whatever happens to Silas is his own doing." The next morning, Sheriff Reeves and Detective Flynn arrived at the Blackwood home with a warrant for Silas's arrest. Silas tried to run. He made it halfway to his horse before Flynn tackled him to the ground. The great banker, the pillar of the community, reduced to struggling in the dirt like a common criminal. They brought him to the sheriff's office in chains. The town gathered to watch, stunned and horrified by the fall of a man they had respected and feared. In his cell, with Kane in the cell next to him, nursing his wounded shoulder, Silas finally broke. "I want to make a deal," he told Flynn. "I'll tell you everything about Whitmore, about Hale, about the embezzlement, all of it, in exchange for a reduced sentence." Flynn agreed, and Silas confessed. He had been stealing from Whitmore for years, had built his entire New Mexico empire on money embezzled from their joint ventures. When Whitmore discovered the theft, Silas had panicked. He had convinced Hale to murder Whitmore, promising that they would split the factory's assets. But Margaret had witnessed the crime. Not the murder itself, but enough. She had seen Hale leaving Whitmore's office, had seen the business papers on Whitmore's desk that connected Silas to the embezzlement. So Silas had ordered Hale to frame her, to make it look like Margaret had killed Whitmore during a robbery. When Hale started to crack under the pressure, started talking about confessing, Silas had sent men to Boston to silence him. They had thrown Hale from his office window and made it look like suicide. For years, Silas thought he had gotten away with it, but then Margaret had resurfaced in Fort Stanton, in his own town. Living on the ranch of a man who owed him money, he had seen an opportunity. Frame Margaret again, collect the reward, eliminate the witness, and seize William's land in the process. But he had underestimated the strength of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The confession was damning, complete, irrefutable. Detective Flynn sent a telegram to Boston that evening. Within hours, a response came back. All charges against Margaret Carter were dropped. She was a free woman. When William and Eleanor brought the news to Margaret, she collapsed in tears. Years of running, years of fear and uncertainty, all of it was over. "You're free, Mama," Eleanor said, holding her mother close. "You're finally free." That night, the community of Fort Stanton organized an impromptu celebration. Families brought food and drink to the town square. Someone produced a fiddle. Dancing began as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. Eleanor danced with William, laughing as he apologized for his lack of skill and stepped on her toes. "I don't care if you're the worst dancer in New Mexico," Eleanor told him, her arms around his neck and her face tilted up to his, "as long as you keep looking at me like that." "Like what?" William asked, though the smile tugging at his mouth suggested he knew exactly what she meant. "Like I'm home," Eleanor said softly. "You are home," William replied, and kissed her again, to the hoots and hollers of their friends and neighbors. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in front of her classroom, teaching 20 students instead of 6. The small barn corner had been replaced by a proper schoolhouse, built by the community, and funded in part by the reward money Margaret had received for her role in bringing Silas Blackwood to justice. Margaret herself had regained her health remarkably. Without the constant fear and stress, her symptoms had largely disappeared. She still coughed sometimes, still tired easily, but she was vibrant and alive in ways Eleanor had not seen in years. She had also caught the attention of Sheriff Reeves, a widower who had begun finding excuses to visit the ranch with increasing frequency. Eleanor suspected that before long, she might be planning another wedding. The ranch had prospered. With Silas gone and his debts forgiven by the court, William had expanded his herd and hired more hands. The land that Silas had threatened to take was now thriving under William's careful stewardship. And Eleanor herself had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Her hand rested on her swollen belly as she wrote arithmetic problems on the chalkboard. 6 months pregnant with William's child and happier than she had ever imagined possible. That evening, as the sun set in its customary glory, William took Eleanor to the Overlook, the place where he had first told her he was falling in love with her, the place where he had asked her to marry him. They sat on the same flat rock, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Do you ever regret it?" William asked. "Answering that advertisement coming here?" Eleanor thought about the question seriously, about the fear and uncertainty of that first arrival, about the danger they had faced, about how close they had come to losing everything. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This is the life I was meant to have. You are the man I was meant to love. If I could go back and do it all again, I wouldn't change a thing, except maybe to hurry that stagecoach along so I could get here faster." William laughed, the sound rich and full of the that had characterized their year together. "Good, because I can't imagine my life without you in it. You and your mother showing up that day, turning everything upside down. Best thing that ever happened to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in colors that still took Eleanor's breath away even after a year of New Mexico sunsets. "I've been thinking about names," Eleanor said, "for the baby. Oh, if it's a boy, I'd like to name him Thomas, after my father." She paused. "And if it's a girl, Margaret, after my mother." "Both good names," William agreed. "Though knowing your stubbornness and my temper, this child might be more than we can handle, regardless of what we call them." Eleanor laughed and swatted his arm gently. Our child will be perfect. Our child will be loved, William corrected. And that's all that really matters. As the last light faded from the sky, William helped Eleanor to her feet. They stood together on that high place looking down at the ranch that had become their home, at the life they had built from desperation and hope. Thank you, Eleanor said softly. For what? For saying my home has room for both. For not turning us away. For giving us a chance when no one else would. William pulled her close, careful of her pregnant belly. You gave me a chance too, Ellie. A chance to be more than just a lonely rancher working himself to death. A chance to have a family, a real home. That's a gift I'll never take for granted. They rode back to the ranch as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. And as they approached the house, Eleanor could see lights in the windows. Margaret moving around the kitchen, preparing dinner. Samuel playing with the ranch dogs in the yard. A home, a family, a future. All because a desperate woman had answered an advertisement. All because a lonely man had chosen kindness over caution. All because two people had been brave enough to reach for something better, even when the odds were against them. The stagecoach that had brought Eleanor and Margaret to Fort Stanton was long gone, carrying other passengers to other destinations. But the impact of that arrival would echo through generations. In time, Eleanor and William's children would grow and have children of their own. The ranch would expand and prosper. The school Eleanor built would educate hundreds of students over the decades. And the story of the mail-order bride who arrived with her elderly mother and the rancher who said, "My home has room for both," would become legend in Fort Stanton. A tale told and retold about love and courage and the power of second chances. But that was all in the future. For now, there was dinner to eat and laughter to share and another day of their lives to be grateful for. Eleanor dismounted with William's help and walked into the house that had become her home. Margaret looked up from the stove and smiled. Samuel ran to hug William's legs. This was what mattered, not the past with all its pain and fear, not the future with all its uncertainty, but this moment, this family, this love. Eleanor's hand found William's and his fingers interlaced with hers, automatically as natural as breathing. They were home.